one of the concerns we have at the moment is that there is a move led by the report that has come from the Australian Law Reform Commission to abolish Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act, which would remove the ability of the leaders of faith-based schools to employ people who actually support their faith, their values, who commit to modelling and living out the values that that school produces. And what the schools have said and what human rights lawyers have indicated is that this would fundamentally undermine the ability of faith-based schools to be different from a school that was run by any other authority, including state schools. And it's important to realise that faith-based schools generally exist for one of two reasons: either the charitable mission of the church, looking to support the broader community, or because parents wish to have their children educated within a community of shared faith and values. And so in the Australian context, the Josephite order established by Mary Killip back in the 1860s is a great example of the first reason, where she established schools and orphanages as well as ministries to the aged poor, to prisoners and to the incurably ill. And international human rights law recognises the right of faith-based groups to establish and maintain charitable organisations with a distinctive religious nature. And particularly in 1981, the Declaration of the General Assembly, Article 6, subpara B, is the most recent reference to that right. But in the second group, many low-fee, faith-based schools in contemporary Australia actually have their origins in the actions of parents who have taken the trouble to establish an alternative to the public system because they want to work with others who share their faith and their worldview to create an environment for the education of their children. And rather than seek to impose their views on other people, they have actually created an alternative. And this is also specifically supported in international human rights law, both in Article 13.3 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which states that parents have the liberty to choose schools for their children other than those established by public authorities to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions, as well as Article 13.4, which provides a guarantee that individuals and bodies may establish private educational institutions, and that obviously the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18.4. Now, these laws come, these human rights laws come from the experience of World War II, where we saw just massive loss worldwide, where nearly 3% of the world's population perished, and world leaders came together afterwards to look at the root causes. And for those who are interested, I've written a reasonable article on the Menzies Research Centre that goes into the background of where those laws come from. But they also, importantly, recognise that sometimes those freedoms, which include freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom from discrimination, but also freedom of religion, are all equal, and they can't be dealt with separately, as in one is more important than the other. They all have to be balanced. And there was a meeting, now known as the Syracuse Principles, that give guidance on how those things are balanced. And importantly, there are some principles, and the first of those is necessity. Any limiting of a right in order to protect another right must be strictly necessary to achieve that, as well as proportional. And that leads to one of the concerns that we see currently with the Australian Law Reform Commission report into faith-based schools, in the light of the government's direction that they were to put forward a model whereby the government said schools can't discriminate, but they have to be able to maintain their religious ethos. And that's almost an impossible balance to obtain unless you take the approach that Justice Durrington, who's the immediate past president of the ALEC, took, where she said that if faith-based schools are operating in accordance with their faith and their ethos, they do not discriminate, which actually meets the first two limbs of the current government terms of reference, as well as obviously meeting the third, enabling the faith-based community to maintain their religious standing and approach. which is why so many parents send their children to those schools. So the problems I have with the ALRC report is that they believe it is necessary to completely remove Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, which, as I said before, would prevent schools from being able to employ people who share their faith and to have a consistent community that model that faith and teach that faith to the children. They make a large part in their report about proportionality, but ignore the necessity. And parliamentary research shows that it is not necessary because there are, within half an hour's drive, within 25 kilometres around Australia, there is a state-based or an independent school for every religious school, with the exception of 16 very small schools in the top of the Northern Territory and Western Australia, which means that it's not necessary to limit the rights of hundreds of thousands of people of faith for the very few numbers of people who have indicated that they have felt discrimination at a faith-based school, which is only 0.02%, for example, of the complaints in Queensland at the Human Rights Commission. So there is another option there. The government has taken, I think, a dreadful approach in gagging faith leaders in terms of consultations around this. The Parliament has not seen the bill that the government is planning to put forward. And as we lead into this Easter, people in Australia, particularly people of faith, should be concerned that there is no transparency, there is no openness about what is being proposed, and even discussion today about deals being done with the Greens, and we should be requiring that it follows the normal process of the Senate, where that legislation is tabled so the Senate and the Australian public can scrutinise what is being proposed by the Albanese government.